I was sitting in the sterile hospital waiting room, my hands trembling as I clutched Richard's jacket, when a folded document fell from the inside pocket. At 69 years old, married for barely 8 months, I thought I was about to lose my second great love to a sudden stroke. But what I found in that pocket changed everything. The document was a real estate appraisal for my mansion, the beachfront estate Richard didn't know I owned, the one I'd told him we were house-sitting for my late husband's trust. The appraisal was dated 3 weeks earlier, long before Richard's medical emergency, and it wasn't just an appraisal. Clipped to it were architectural plans showing my home subdivided into luxury condos with projected sale prices totaling $6.2 million. My heart stopped, not from grief, from ice-cold realization. I looked up at Richard's daughter, Diane, who'd been so supportive during this crisis, hovering near me with tissues and coffee. She was on her phone, turned away, and I heard her whisper, "Mom's playing her part perfectly. The old lady's completely buying it. Once Dad wakes up tomorrow and we get her signature on the POA, we move to phase 2. Mom's playing her part? Old lady? That's when I understood. The man I'd married, the man who'd courted me with poetry and sunset walks on the beach, the man who was supposedly clinging to life in the ICU, was part of a con. And I was the mark. Have you ever felt the exact moment your entire reality shatters? I need you to understand, I wasn't some foolish old woman desperate for companionship. I'd been an accountant for 35 years. I'd managed multi-million-dollar portfolios. I'd survived widowhood, cancer, and rebuilding my life from scratch. But love made me blind. I quietly slipped the documents back into Richard's jacket, my mind racing. I didn't confront Diane. I didn't scream or cry. Instead, I did what I'd trained myself to do in my professional life. I gathered information. Over the next 2 hours, while pretending to be the devastated, worried wife, I excused myself to the bathroom 4 times. Each time, I photographed every document in Richard's jacket, Diane's purse when she carelessly left it on her chair, and the medical files Kyle, Richard's son, kept checking on his tablet that he left unlocked beside his coffee. What I discovered made my blood run cold. This wasn't a sudden, opportunistic crime. This was a meticulously planned operation that began months before Richard even asked me out. There were surveillance photos of me from 6 months before our first date, background checks, financial estimates of my net worth, wildly overestimated at $8 million, which explained their enthusiasm, and a detailed timeline with phrases that made my stomach turn. Trust-building phase, medical crisis phase, legal capture phase, asset liquidation phase. And then I saw it. The final phase, written in Kyle's precise handwriting, disposal phase, institutionalization or accident. They'd actually written that. They'd planned to make me disappear. But here's what Richard and his 5 relatives didn't know about me. Here's what they couldn't have discovered in their background checks or surveillance. I hadn't told my new husband the truth about the mansion because my late husband's attorney had advised me to protect my assets. The estate was in an irrevocable trust. Richard's name wasn't on anything. I'd kept separate bank accounts, separate credit, separate everything. Not because I didn't trust love, but because I'd learned to love smartly. They thought they were hunting a vulnerable widow. They had no idea they'd targeted a woman who'd spent 4 decades reading financial criminals' playbooks. I looked at Diane, still on her phone, coordinating with her siblings. I looked at the ICU doors where my husband was faking unconsciousness, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to be anyone's victim. But to understand what I did next, I need to take you back to where this all began, because the story of how they tried to destroy me is also the story of how I destroyed them first. My name is Eleanor Patricia Morrison, and 2 years before that hospital waiting room, I was living in what most people would call paradise, a 6-bedroom beachfront mansion in Malibu, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The house had been in my family since 1978, when my parents bought the property for $200,000. Now it was worth $4.5 million. But paradise feels awfully empty when you're rattling around in it alone. My husband David had passed suddenly from a heart attack at 71. We'd built a beautiful life together over 42 years. He was a maritime attorney, sharp as a tack and kind to his core. I was a senior accountant at a major firm, the kind of woman who could spot a discrepancy in a 1,000-page financial report. We'd been careful, strategic, and smart with money. When my parents passed, they left the mansion to me in a family trust. David and I lived there for 4 decades, watching the ocean and growing old together. After David died, the silence in that big house was deafening. My daughter Emily lived in Boston with her own family. My son was in Singapore building his career. I had friends, book clubs, charity work, all the things widows are supposed to do to fill their days. But at night, when the Pacific fog rolled in and the house creaked, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I started attending charity events just to be around people. That's where I met Richard Morrison at an ocean conservation gala 14 months ago. He was 71, silver-haired and handsome in that weathered, distinguished way. He told me he was recently widowed after his wife of 35 years passed away. He quoted Yeats. He brought me white roses. He listened to my stories about David without that uncomfortable shifting some men do when widows talk about their late husbands. For 3 months, we dated like we were young again. Dinners overlooking the water, walks on the beach at sunset. He seemed financially comfortable. He told me he'd been a maritime insurance consultant with a modest pension and a condo in Santa Monica. He never asked about money, never seemed interested in my finances. Looking back, that studied disinterest should have been my first red flag. It was too perfect, too careful. When he proposed after 4 months, I said yes. My daughter Emily was cautious on our video call. "Mom, that's pretty fast. What do you really know about him?" But I was 67, he was 71. How much time did we have to waste being careful? I wanted to feel alive again. I wanted someone to share morning coffee with, someone to hold my hand during movies, someone to grow old with. Again. We had a small wedding at the mansion, just 30 people and a string quartet on the terrace. His family came, Diane, his daughter, a real estate agent with a bright smile and calculating eyes I didn't notice then. Kyle, his son, a corporate lawyer with expensive suits and an even more expensive handshake. Vanessa, Kyle's wife, who'd been a nurse and had that professional warmth that feels genuine until you realize it's practiced. Gregory, his nephew, quiet and watchful. And Janet, Richard's sister, who cried during the ceremony and told me she was so happy her brother had found love again. They were all so welcoming. Diane hugged me and called me Mom. Kyle toasted our beautiful blended family. I felt like I'd gained not just a husband, but a whole support system. I felt lucky. That first night, as Richard and I stood on our bedroom balcony watching moonlight shimmer on the water, he casually asked, "So this incredible place, is it owned by your late husband's estate? I just want to make sure I'm not stepping on any legal toes." I'd already planned my answer with Timothy Hayes, David's former law partner and my estate attorney. "It's complicated trust stuff," I said vaguely. "Timothy handles all that, but we're fine to live here. It's all arranged." Richard smiled and kissed my forehead. "I'm just a simple guy, Elle. I don't understand all that legal complexity. I'm just grateful to wake up somewhere beautiful with you." Simple guy. I should have heard the warning in those words. The first month of marriage was wonderful. Richard was attentive, loving, genuinely happy. But small things started bothering me. Little inconsistencies that my accountant's brain couldn't ignore. He'd mentioned his Santa Monica condo multiple times, said he was renting it out as an investment property. But one afternoon I called the number he'd given me for the property manager and got a disconnected line. When I mentioned it that evening, Richard laughed it off. "Oh, I must have given you the old number. Property management companies change constantly." Then there was Diane. She started visiting, a lot. Always with some excuse. Just in the neighborhood. Wanted to see how you lovebirds are doing. But I noticed her eyes constantly appraising the house. She'd run her hands along the original crown molding, comment on the hardwood floors, ask detailed questions about when the kitchen was last renovated, whether the property could be subdivided. One Sunday afternoon, she showed up with a couple she introduced as dear friends who were just curious about the neighborhood. They walked through my entire house asking questions about square footage, lot lines, zoning restrictions. I felt like livestock being evaluated at auction. When I mentioned this to Richard later, he laughed. Diane's just passionate about real estate, honey. You know how agents get excited about beautiful properties. Don't read into it. But I was reading into it. Because I'd spent 35 years reading financial documents, and people's behavior is a document if you know how to read it. Kyle called 2 months into the marriage and asked to take me to lunch. Over expensive sushi in Santa Monica, he gently suggested that Richard and I should consolidate our assets for tax purposes. It's just smart financial planning, he said smoothly, his lawyer voice all reason and concern. Especially at your ages. Sorry to be morbid, but estate planning is crucial. I could handle everything pro bono. Family rate, meaning completely free. Something about the way he said, consolidate our assets, made my skin prickle. I smiled sweetly and said, that's so thoughtful, Kyle, but I have an excellent attorney who's handled my affairs for 30 years. Timothy Hayes, maybe you know him. He was David's law partner. Kyle's smile tightened just slightly. Hayes and Morrison? They're a bit old school, aren't they? I specialize in modern asset protection strategies. I'm comfortable with old school, I said. That evening, I was walking past the guest room to get towels from the hall closet when I heard Kyle on the phone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his frustrated tone stopped me. She's got her own attorney, he was saying. Some old guy from her husband's firm. No, she wouldn't bite on the consolidation angle. We might need to move to Plan B faster than we thought. Plan B? My heart started pounding. I backed away silently, my mind racing. Then there was Vanessa. She'd been a nurse before staying home with her kids, and she was constantly expressing concern about my health. Eleanor, you look tired. Are you sleeping well? You should get that checked. Eleanor, you forgot you told me that story yesterday. Has your memory been tested recently? Eleanor, that's the 3rd time you've misplaced your reading glasses today. Early dementia runs in families, you know. Except I wasn't forgetting things. I wasn't misplacing my glasses more than any normal person. She was planting seeds, trying to make me doubt my own mind, trying to build a narrative of incompetence. The turning point came 4 months into the marriage. I came home early from a doctor's appointment that had been canceled. I walked into my study, a room I'd specifically asked Richard's family to treat as my private space, and found Diane and Richard hunched over my desk, going through my locked filing cabinet. They froze when they saw me. Eleanor! Richard's smile was too bright, too fast. We were just looking for that Italian restaurant menu you mentioned. The one you loved? In my locked filing cabinet? I kept my voice calm even as my pulse hammered. The one that requires a key I keep on my personal keychain? Diane laughed, but it sounded brittle, forced. Oh my God, we're so sorry. I thought this was the kitchen desk. All these big rooms look the same, you know? My study and my kitchen looked nothing alike, and that filing cabinet had been locked. I'd locked it myself that morning. But here's the thing. I'd tested them. The week before, I'd deliberately left a fake document on top of that cabinet. A bogus letter from a made-up attorney discussing a fake $2 million investment property in Carmel. I wanted to see if anyone was snooping. Now I walked to the cabinet and checked. The fake document was gone. Did either of you see a letter that was sitting right here? I asked, pointing to the empty space. No, they both said. Too quickly, too synchronized. I knew in that moment something was deeply, terribly wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Richard was snoring softly beside me. this man I'd married, this man I'd trusted with my heart and my home. But I didn't know him at all, did I? At 2 a.m., I got up and went to my laptop in the study. I did what I should have done before I ever said, I do. A deep background check. What I found made my hands shake so badly I had to set down my coffee. Richard Morrison had been married 3 times before me, not once. His second wife, Margaret Chen, had died in a suspicious fall down the stairs at age 70, ruled accidental, but there'd been a contested will. His first wife, Patricia Morrison, had died of a medication overdose at 68, also ruled accidental. But the archived police reports showed inconsistencies that investigators had noted but never pursued. Both wives had been wealthy. Both had died within 2 years of marrying Richard. Both had estates that ended up benefiting Richard and his children despite contested wills that mysteriously got settled in their favor. And Diane? She wasn't just a real estate agent. She'd been investigated for fraud 3 years ago for forging seller signatures on property documents. The case was dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the smoke was there, thick and choking. Kyle had been suspended from practicing law for 6 months in 2019 for ethical violations related to pressuring elderly clients to change their wills. I sat there in the darkness, reading about my husband's family's pattern of targeting wealthy widows, and I realized with horrible clarity I was next on their list. Margaret, Patricia, and now Eleanor, the lonely widow with the beachfront mansion. But I had one advantage they didn't know about. They thought the mansion belonged to David's estate. They thought I was a comfortable guest with some savings. They had no idea that I personally owned this property outright through my family trust, that I had $800,000 in accounts they knew nothing about, that I'd kept my financial life completely separate on Timothy's advice. I sat there watching my sleeping husband, this stranger, this predator, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to run. I was going to investigate, document, and gather enough evidence to bury them all. They wanted to play a long game? I'd been playing financial chess for 4 decades, and I never lost. The morning after my 2 a.m. discovery, I woke up next to a stranger. Richard was the same man physically, same silver hair, same weathered hands, same morning smile. But now when he kissed my cheek and asked, "Sleep well, beautiful?" I saw a predator's calculation instead of affection. Wonderfully, I lied, matching his smile. If he could act, so could I. I'd spent my career analyzing financial patterns, catching inconsistencies in corporate books that others missed. I knew how to look at people without them knowing they were being examined. And I knew the cardinal rule of catching criminals. Never reveal you're onto them until you have irrefutable evidence. My first call was to Timothy Hayes. I told Richard I had a routine estate paperwork review. He seemed pleased I was being responsible. I met Timothy at his office that afternoon. He was 74, with 50 years of legal experience and eyes that missed nothing. When I laid out everything I'd discovered, the background checks, the dead wives, Diane's fraud investigation, Kyle's ethical violations, his face went grim. "Eleanor, this is serious. These aren't just opportunistic gold diggers. This is a criminal pattern." He pulled up his computer, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "Let me make some calls." Within 2 hours, Timothy had connected me with Detective Sarah Blackwood from the Financial Crimes Division. We met in a private conference room at the police station. Sarah was 40, sharp-eyed, with the kind of focused intensity that made me feel safer just being near her. "We've had our eye on Richard Morrison," she told me, leaning forward, "but we've never been able to get solid evidence. His previous wives are dead. They can't testify. The families settled civil suits quietly, with NDAs attached. We've suspected a long con operation for years, but we've never had someone on the inside willing to cooperate." "I'm willing," I said. My voice was steady. "What do you need?" "Evidence. Recordings of them discussing their plans. Documents showing intent to defraud. Proof of conspiracy. Can you do that without putting yourself in danger?" Could I? I was 69 years old. I was supposed to be enjoying retirement, taking cruises, spoiling grandchildren, not playing undercover operative in my own home. But when I thought about Margaret Chen falling down those stairs, about Patricia Morrison's accidental overdose, about whatever other women Richard had targeted that we didn't even know about, I knew what I had to do. I can do it, I said. Over the next week, with Sarah's guidance and Timothy's legal oversight, I turned my mansion into a surveillance operation. I hired what appeared to be a home security consultation company, actually a police-approved contractor who installed hidden cameras in every room except bathrooms and bedrooms. They were disguised as smoke detectors, picture frames, decorative objects, completely invisible unless you knew what to look for. I told Richard we were upgrading our security system after a neighbor's break-in. He seemed pleased, even helped the installers move furniture. "Good thinking, Elle," he said, squeezing my shoulder. "Can't be too careful these days." The irony was suffocating. I also started keeping my phone in my pocket constantly, voice recording activated. Every conversation, every interaction, building my case sentence by sentence. And I created a decoy laptop, one I left carelessly on the kitchen counter with fake financial documents suggesting I had investment accounts worth $3 million more than I actually did. I wanted to see if they'd take the bait. They took it eagerly. 3 days later, my hidden camera in the study caught Richard at 2 a.m, scrolling through that decoy laptop, photographing screens with his phone. He was methodical, professional, zooming in on account numbers, taking multiple shots of each page. This wasn't his first time doing this. The camera caught everything in perfect clarity. His face, the documents, the calculated way he checked over his shoulder every few minutes. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, while Richard was at his consulting job, I doubted that was real either. I felt physically sick. This man had held me, made love to me, whispered that I was his second chance at happiness, and he was cataloging my assets like I was livestock to be sold. But the really damning evidence came the following week. Diane called and suggested lunch. Just us girls, some quality stepmom-daughter time. I agreed, wearing a jacket with my recording phone hidden in the inside pocket. Over Caesar salads at an upscale restaurant in Santa Monica, she steered the conversation to Richard's health. "Dad seems more tired lately, don't you think? A bit slower? Has he been to a doctor?" "He seems fine to me," I said carefully, taking a bite of salad I couldn't taste. "Well, at his age, you can't be too careful." She leaned in, her voice dropping to that concerned tone that now made my skin crawl. "Mom, my biological mom, died of a stroke, you know. It runs in families. Has Dad updated his medical power of attorney? Just in case something happens, you'd want to be able to make decisions for him, right?" "We've both designated each other," I lied smoothly. "We hadn't actually signed anything. I'd been stalling on all legal documents, claiming I wanted Timothy to review everything first." Her face flickered with frustration for just a second before she caught herself. "Of course. But you know, these things should be reviewed by professionals who specialize in elder law. Kyle could help you both. Make sure everything's airtight, especially with the property situation being so complicated." There it was, the property situation. "What do you mean?" I asked innocently, my heart pounding but my face carefully neutral. "Well, you're living in your late husband's estate property, right? If something happened to you, Richard could be left in a terrible position. No legal rights to the home, vulnerable to the estate's decisions about selling or evicting. And vice versa. If something happened to Dad, you'd have no protection. You should really protect each other legally. Kyle's helped so many families navigate this." She was smooth. She was selling this as protection for us, when really she was angling to get Richard's name on my property or get me to sign documents that would give them control when the time came. "That's so thoughtful, Diane," I said sweetly, reaching across to pat her hand. "I'll definitely talk to Timothy about it." Her smile tightened. "Timothy's great, but he's more of a traditional estate attorney. This kind of second marriage asset protection requires specialized knowledge. Kyle really should. I trust Timothy. I interrupted gently but firmly. He's never steered me wrong. The lunch ended shortly after. She picked up the check, probably thought it was an investment in her future payday, and hugged me goodbye. Think about what I said, Eleanor. We just want you both protected. As I watched her drive away in her BMW, I thought, I know exactly what you want, and you're not getting it. But the conversation that truly terrified me happened 2 weeks later. I'd started taking evening walks on the beach alone, partly to process everything, partly to give Richard and his family opportunities to act without me present, knowing the cameras were recording everything. I came back earlier than expected one evening, entering through the side door quietly. I heard voices in the dining room: Richard, Diane, Kyle, Vanessa, and Gregory. I activated my phone recording and crept closer to the doorway, staying out of sight in the darkened hallway. Can't wait much longer, Kyle was saying, his lawyer voice clipped and impatient. She's getting suspicious. She keeps deflecting every suggestion about consolidating assets or updating legal documents. That lawyer of hers is a problem. Mom's smarter than we thought, Diane admitted. I could hear the frustration in her voice. But she's also emotionally invested. We can use that. She wants to believe Dad loves her. My chest tightened. I pressed my back against the wall, forcing myself to breathe quietly. The medical emergency scenario is still our best play, Vanessa said, and her voice had that clinical detachment I'd heard from nurses discussing treatment plans. I can get the medication to simulate stroke symptoms. Benzodiazepines combined with a muscle relaxant. Nothing that causes permanent damage, but convincing enough to get him hospitalized. Once he's in ICU, Eleanor will be vulnerable, scared, emotional. That's when you step in, Kyle, with the medical POA documents. She'll sign anything to help him. They were planning to drug Richard, to fake a medical emergency, to use my love for him as a weapon against me. And once we have medical POA in her name, but with Kyle as backup decision-maker, Diane continued. Then we stage her mental incompetence, Kyle finished. Gregory's been documenting her concerning behaviors, forgetting conversations, confusion, wandering around at odd hours. Vanessa's been building a medical narrative with her concerns about Eleanor's memory. Once Dad recovers, we flip it. Get a judge to declare Eleanor incompetent due to early-stage dementia. I become her conservator. Then we liquidate the assets, move Eleanor to a care facility, and split everything 5 ways. I was gripping the wall to stay upright. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized. They were planning to steal everything and lock me away in some facility where I'd spend my final years drugged and alone. Have you ever heard people casually discussing destroying your life? It's a special kind of horror. What about her kids? Janet's voice, Richard's sister. Won't they fight it? Her daughters in Boston, sons in Singapore, Diane said dismissively. By the time they realize what's happening and fly back, it'll be done. Legal fait accompli. And honestly, they're busy with their own lives. How often do they even visit? She wasn't wrong. Emily and I video chatted weekly, but she'd only visited once since David died. My son and I exchanged emails. They loved me, but they were living their own lives thousands of miles away. And the lawyer? Vanessa asked. This Timothy Hayes? Kyle scoffed. He's 74 years old school estate planning guy. We'll bury him in motions and paperwork. He's used to wills and trusts, not defending against a competency challenge backed by medical evidence. He won't know what hit him. Then Richard spoke, and his voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. Just make sure the medication doesn't actually hurt me, Vanessa. I don't want real damage. It's temporary, she assured him. You'll feel like hell for 24 hours. Nausea, weakness, confusion. But you'll recover completely. Small price for a $5 million payout. They laughed. Actually laughed, joking about destroying my life like it was a casual business transaction. Like I was nothing. Nobody. Just an obstacle between them and money. I backed away silently, went out the front door without making a sound, and walked down to the beach. I sat on the sand in the darkness, listening to the waves crash, and let myself cry for exactly 5 minutes. 5 minutes to grieve the love I'd thought I had, the family I'd thought I'd gained, the future I'd imagined. Then I stopped crying, pulled out my phone, and called Detective Sarah Blackwood. "I have them," I said, my voice steady now. "I have everything." Over the next 3 days, Sarah and I met secretly at the police station. I provided her with hidden camera footage of Richard photographing my fake financial documents, audio recordings of the family discussing the medical emergency plot, documentation of Diane's fraud investigation history, evidence of Kyle's previous ethical violations, and research into Margaret and Patricia's deaths showing the suspicious patterns. Sarah reviewed everything methodically, taking notes. "This is enough for conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and potentially more. But Eleanor," she looked up at me seriously, "here's the problem. They haven't actually committed the crime yet. They've planned it extensively, but planning isn't the same as execution in terms of criminal prosecution. A good defense attorney might get most of this suppressed as speculation or get the charges reduced." "What are you saying?" My stomach dropped. "I'm saying we need to catch them in the act. We need to let the medical emergency scenario play out with our safeguards in place and document them actually attempting to defraud you. Then we can hit them with charges that will stick, that they can't weasel out of with expensive lawyers." She saw the fear in my face. "I know what I'm asking. I know it's risky. But Eleanor, it's the only way to guarantee they face real consequences. And more importantly, it's the only way to make sure they can't do this to anyone else. Think about the next widow they target if we don't stop them completely." I thought about Margaret and Patricia. I thought about whoever might come after me. Some other lonely widow who just wanted companionship in her golden years. "Okay," I said, "but I have conditions. I want my personal physician, Dr. Marcus Chen, read into this operation. I want him at whatever hospital Richard goes to, monitoring everything. I want control over what documents I'm shown. And I want you and your team there, ready to move the moment we have what we need." "Done," Sarah said without hesitation. We spent the next week preparing. Dr. Chen was briefed and agreed to be on call. Sarah positioned plainclothes officers. Timothy prepared counter-legal documents, including updated trust documents that would make it crystal clear the mansion was mine, restraining orders ready to file, and evidence packets for criminal charges. And I prepared myself emotionally for what was coming. I had to watch my husband fake a stroke. I had to pretend to be a terrified, vulnerable wife. I had to play the exact role they'd written for me, right up until the moment I flipped the script entirely. The morning it happened, I was ready. But nothing could have prepared me for how it would feel. Richard and I were having breakfast on the terrace overlooking the ocean. He was talking about maybe taking a trip to Catalina Island, planning our future like we actually had one. He seemed relaxed, affectionate. He reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm so glad I found you, Elle," he said, and his eyes looked sincere. The performance was perfect. Then suddenly, his face went slack. His eyes rolled back. He slumped forward, knocking over his coffee cup, the dark liquid spreading across the white tablecloth. "Richard!" I screamed. "Richard, what's happening?" His body convulsed convincingly. If I hadn't known it was staged, I would have been completely fooled. For a moment, even knowing the truth, my heart seized with fear. That's how good he was. I called 911 exactly as they'd expected, my voice shaking, my words tumbling over each other. The dispatcher talked me through checking his pulse, his breathing. I rode in the ambulance, holding his hand, crying real tears. Not for him, but for the death of every beautiful lie he'd ever told me. But what they didn't know was that the paramedic taking Richard's vitals was actually collecting blood samples for Dr. Chen to test immediately. What they didn't know was that Detective Blackwood was already at the hospital, waiting in plain clothes. What they didn't know was that every word spoken from that moment on was being recorded with judicial authorization. And what they didn't know was that while they thought they were springing their trap on me, I was springing mine on them. We arrived at the hospital. Richard was rushed to the ICU. I played the devastated wife perfectly, trembling, pale, unable to catch my breath. A nurse brought me water. A doctor spoke to me in soothing tones about running tests. Within an hour, they all arrived. Diane, Kyle, Vanessa, Janet, even Gregory, surrounding me with false comfort like vultures circling wounded prey. "Oh, Eleanor," Diane hugged me tight. I could smell her expensive perfume. "Don't worry, we're here for you. We're family. We'll get through this together." Family. The word tasted like poison. Kyle pulled me aside, his hand on my elbow, his voice low and urgent. "Eleanor, I know this is terrible timing, but there are some legal documents you need to sign, just to make sure you can make medical decisions for Dad if the doctors need authorization for procedures. It's standard stuff, but it needs to be done now." He produced papers from his leather briefcase, medical power of attorney forms. But I could see, even in my distressed state, that these weren't standard. There were clauses about family consensus on major decisions, clauses that would give Kyle secondary authority, clauses designed to trap me. I can't think straight," I said, my voice shaking. It wasn't entirely acting. "This is all so sudden." I know," Kyle said soothingly, pressing a pen into my hand. "But the doctors might need authorization for emergency procedures. We need to do this now, Eleanor. For Dad." Vanessa appeared at my other elbow with a woman in scrubs I didn't recognize. "Eleanor, you look so pale. Your blood pressure must be through the roof with all this stress. Let me take you to get checked out." "Mrs. Morrison?" A familiar voice cut through. Dr. Marcus Chen appeared, his face professionally neutral. "I need to speak with you privately about your husband's condition." Diane's eyes narrowed. "We're family. We should all hear this." "Hospital policy," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Patient's spouse first, then I can speak with the family." He led me to a private consultation room. The moment the door closed, he said quietly, "Toxicology confirms benzodiazepines and a muscle relaxant in his system. Exactly what Vanessa said she'd use. He'll be fine in 24 hours. It's all staged. But Eleanor, they're moving fast. Be very careful." I nodded, steadying myself. "I'm ready." When I returned to the waiting room, Kyle tried again with the documents. "Did the doctor say anything about needing authorization for treatment? These forms would really help facilitate—" I looked at the papers in his hand, then at his face. I picked up the pen, and then I said the words I'd been planning for days. "Actually, Kyle, I'd like my attorney Timothy Hayes to review these first." My voice was suddenly steadier. "You understand? It's not that I don't trust you. It's just good practice to have these things reviewed by independent counsel." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Kyle's smile became forced. "Eleanor, there really isn't time." "I insist," I said firmly. "Timothy's on his way. He'll be here in 15 minutes." I watched their faces cycle through frustration, calculation, and forced acceptance. They couldn't push too hard without revealing their true intentions. "Of course," Kyle finally said through clenched teeth. "Whatever makes you comfortable." But I saw him exchange glances with Diane. I saw Vanessa texting frantically on her phone. They were panicking, improvising, realizing something was going wrong. Good. I wanted them off balance. I wanted them scared. Because in 15 minutes, Timothy wasn't just bringing his legal expertise. He was bringing Detective Sarah Blackwood, armed with recordings, toxicology reports, and a very specific set of questions for the Morrison family. The trap I'd spent weeks setting was about to spring shut, and they'd walked right into it. The 15 minutes before Timothy arrived felt like 15 hours. I sat in that hospital waiting room, surrounded by people who wanted to destroy me, and maintained my performance of the worried, overwhelmed wife who was one signature away from losing everything. Diane kept offering me terrible coffee from the vending machine. Vanessa kept suggesting I rest in a private room where they could separate me from witnesses and apply more pressure. Kyle kept the fraudulent documents in his briefcase, ready to pounce the moment my resolve weakened. And Janet kept patting my hand, saying, "You're so blessed to have such a supportive family in this crisis." I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her hand and say, "Do you know what your family is doing? Do you know they're planning to lock me away and steal everything I've spent my life building?" But I smiled weakly and whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without all of you." The lies tasted like ashes in my mouth. Finally, Timothy arrived, and he wasn't alone. With him was Detective Sarah Blackwood, in a professional gray pantsuit, her badge clipped to her belt. The effect on the Morrison family was electric. Kyle went rigid, his lawyer instincts screaming danger. Diane's eyes widened, and her practiced smile faltered. Vanessa immediately excused herself, muttering something about checking on Richard, clearly rushing to warn him that police were present. "Detective?" Diane's voice was carefully casual, but I could hear the edge beneath. "Is there some kind of problem?" "Routine questions," Sarah said smoothly, her face professionally neutral. "In cases of sudden medical emergencies involving elderly patients, we sometimes conduct welfare checks to rule out elder abuse. Standard procedure in California." It wasn't standard procedure, but they didn't know that. Timothy sat beside me, and I felt genuine relief for the first time in hours. He squeezed my hand once, a silent message that I wasn't alone anymore. "Eleanor, before you sign anything, let me review those documents Kyle mentioned." Kyle had no choice but to hand over the papers. Timothy put on his reading glasses and began examining them with excruciating slowness, occasionally making sounds and taking notes on a yellow legal pad. The silence stretched. I could see sweat forming on Kyle's upper lip. "These are interesting," Timothy finally said, his tone mild but his eyes sharp. "Kyle, did you draft these yourself?" "Yes," Kyle's voice was clipped. "Why?" "Well, for one thing, this clause here about family consensus for medical decisions exceeding $50,000 would effectively give your family veto power over Eleanor's authority as medical decision-maker. That's highly irregular for a standard medical power of attorney. This isn't about giving Eleanor power. It's about limiting it." The air felt thick with tension. "It's protective language," Kyle said, his lawyer voice emerging, cold and professional, "to prevent any single person from making catastrophic financial decisions without family input." "Protective for whom?" Timothy asked mildly. "And this section about mandatory cognitive assessment requirements, it stipulates that Eleanor would need to undergo mental competency evaluations at the family's request, with results reviewed by a physician of the family's choosing. That's not medical authorization for her husband's care. That's a legal framework for challenging her competency." The silence was deafening. I watched Diane's face go pale. "Are you suggesting," Kyle said slowly, dangerously, "that I would try to harm my stepmother?" "I'm suggesting," Timothy said, his voice still calm but now edged with steel, "that these documents are highly irregular, potentially fraudulent, and absolutely not in my client's best interests. Eleanor will not be signing them, not today, not ever." Diane stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. "This is ridiculous. We're trying to help during a family crisis, and you're turning it into some kind of conspiracy theory." "Actually," Detective Blackwood interrupted, pulling out her badge and holding it up officially, "let's talk about conspiracies. I'm Detective Sarah Blackwood, Financial Crimes Division, LAPD. I've been investigating Richard Morrison and his family for several months now. Eleanor, would you consent to me asking your stepfamily some questions?" My heart was pounding, but my voice was steady. "Of course, Detective." Sarah looked at Kyle. "How many of Richard Morrison's previous wives are you aware of?" Kyle's face went blank. What? He was married to my mother, and then after she died. He was married 3 times before Eleanor, Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting. Patricia Morrison, who died of a medication overdose in 2015. Margaret Chen, who died from a fall downstairs in 2018. And Nancy Blackwell, who divorced your father in 2020 after 15 months of marriage, but not before filing a police report alleging fraud. I watched Kyle process this information, watched him realize how much trouble he was in. Nancy Blackwell filed a report alleging that your father and his family attempted to defraud her of a $3 million property in Newport Beach, Sarah continued. The case was dropped when she accepted a settlement and signed an NDA. But NDAs don't protect against criminal investigations, Kyle. You're a lawyer. You know that. Diane found her voice, high-pitched and desperate. We don't have to listen to this. We're here because my father is sick, and you're harassing us. Your father isn't sick, I said quietly. Everyone turned to look at me. This was it. This was the moment I'd been building toward for weeks. I stood up, my legs steadier than they'd been in months. Richard isn't having a stroke. He was given benzodiazepines and muscle relaxants to simulate stroke symptoms. The toxicology report confirms it. Vanessa, who just returned from the ICU, froze in the doorway. Dr. Marcus Chen, Richard's attending physician and my personal doctor for 25 years, ran a full toxicology screen the moment Richard arrived. I continued, my voice growing stronger with every word. It shows substances that wouldn't be in his system unless someone gave them to him deliberately. Vanessa, as a former nurse, you'd know exactly what combination to use, wouldn't you? This is insane, Vanessa whispered, backing away. Why would we? Because this whole thing is a con, I said, and years of rage and grief and betrayal poured into my voice. You targeted me just like you targeted Margaret and Patricia. You researched me, surveilled me for months, and then Richard coincidentally met me at a charity event. You've been planning this since before our first date. I pulled out my phone and opened the recording app. My hands were shaking, but my voice was clear. I have recordings of all of you discussing this plan. The fake medical emergency, the forged power of attorney documents, the scheme to have me declared mentally incompetent, the plan to liquidate my assets and institutionalize me in a care facility. Kyle's lawyer instincts kicked in immediately. Recordings made without consent aren't admissible in California unless there's reasonable belief that a felony is being committed, Detective Blackwood finished. Elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and forgery are all felonies. The recordings are admissible, Kyle. You should know that. Timothy opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. His hands were steady, his voice calm. I've also prepared a complete timeline of the Morrison family's pattern of targeting wealthy elderly women. 3 dead wives, Patricia, Margaret, and Richard's mother, who supposedly died of a stroke, but whose death certificate shows inconsistencies. 1 divorced wife who settled after filing fraud charges. And now Eleanor. The pattern is documented, clear, and criminal. Janet suddenly burst into tears. I didn't know it would go this far, she sobbed, her carefully maintained composure crumbling. They told me. Diane told me it was just to protect Richard, that Eleanor was taking advantage of him, that we were helping. Shut up, Janet, Diane hissed. But Janet was unraveling, words pouring out between sobs. They showed me papers that they said proved Eleanor was stealing from Richard. I believed them. I wanted to help my brother. But then I heard them talking about the disposal phase, and I realized, oh God, what have I done? What have we done? Janet, don't say another word, Kyle commanded, his voice sharp with panic. Detective Blackwood stepped forward. Actually, Janet, if you'd like to cooperate with our investigation, we should discuss that separately. But first, I need to inform all of you of your rights. She pulled out handcuffs. Diane Morrison, Kyle Morrison, Vanessa Chen Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and assault with intent to administer a harmful substance. The waiting room erupted into chaos. We haven't actually done anything, Diane screamed, her composure completely shattered. You don't have evidence of a completed crime. We haven't stolen anything. We haven't hurt anyone. You drugged a man to fake a medical emergency, Sarah said calmly, approaching Diane with handcuffs. That's assault and battery right there. You presented fraudulent legal documents to obtain power of attorney through deception and coercion. That's attempted fraud and elder abuse. You've created false documentation suggesting Eleanor has cognitive impairment. That's falsification of records. And you conspired as a group to illegally obtain control of Eleanor's assets and have her unlawfully institutionalized. That's criminal conspiracy. We have recordings, witness testimony, toxicology reports, and documentary evidence. Turn around, please. I watched as Sarah cuffed Diane, whose face had gone from tan to ashen. Kyle stood silent, his lawyer brain clearly calculating his options and finding them all terrible. Vanessa was backing away until two uniformed officers I hadn't noticed arriving blocked her path. I want a lawyer, Kyle said flatly. We're not saying anything without legal representation. Smart, Sarah said. You'll need a good one. As the officers began reading them their rights, Janet grabbed my arm. Her face was streaked with mascara, her eyes desperate. Eleanor, I swear I didn't know. I have emails. They told me what to say if anyone asked questions. Gregory was following you, taking pictures out of context to make you look confused. They have a whole file on their computer with a timeline, financial projections, everything. I can show you. I can testify. Please, I didn't know they were actually going to hurt you. Ma'am, we'll need to take your statement separately, one of the officers said, gently guiding Janet away from me. As they led Diane past me in handcuffs, she stopped and looked at me. For a moment I saw real hatred in her eyes, not the fake warmth, not the practiced concern, but pure venom. You think you've won? She spat. You'll spend the rest of your pathetic life alone, you paranoid old bitch. No one will ever love you. You'll die alone in that big, empty house. I looked directly into her eyes, and when I spoke, my voice was calm and clear. I'd rather be alone than be a victim. And I'd rather die in my own home than let you steal it. The officer pulled Diane away, her curses echoing down the hospital corridor. Timothy put his hand on my shoulder. Eleanor, you need to understand. This is just the beginning of a long legal process. Criminal charges, likely civil suits, possibly testimony in multiple cases if Nancy Blackwell decides to reopen her case now that there's criminal prosecution. Margaret's and Patricia's families might pursue wrongful death investigations. I understand, I said. My whole body was shaking now, adrenaline finally crashing through my system. And Richard, Sarah said gently, gesturing toward the ICU. He's going to wake up in a few hours and find his family arrested and his wife fully aware of everything. We'll be arresting him too, but we wanted to secure the initial evidence and statements first. Would you like to see him before he wakes up? Would I? I'd spent months falling in love with a lie. I'd let this man into my home, my bed, my heart, and he'd been planning to destroy me the entire time. Yes, I said. I want to see him. Sarah escorted me to Richard's ICU room. He was lying in the hospital bed, looking peaceful, innocent. The medication was wearing off. I could see his fingers starting to twitch slightly, his breathing becoming less labored. An officer stood by the door. Everything he said from this point forward would be recorded as evidence. I stood looking at this man I'd married. I'd loved him, or I'd loved who I thought he was. That person had never existed. Richard, I said softly. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening as the drugs cleared his system. He saw me, and his face immediately transformed into worry and confusion, still playing his part, still performing. Eleanor? What happened? Where am I? You're in the hospital, I said calmly. You had a medical emergency. Or, more accurately, you pretended to have one after Vanessa gave you drugs to fake stroke symptoms so your family could pressure me into signing fraudulent legal documents. His face went completely blank. The mask dropped. Just for a second, I saw the real Richard Morrison, cold, calculating, and completely devoid of any warmth or love. The man behind the performance. "Your family has been arrested," I continued, my voice steady even though my heart was breaking. "Kyle, Diane, and Vanessa are in custody. The police have recordings of your entire plan. Your toxicology report shows exactly what you took. I've provided evidence of your pattern of targeting and defrauding wealthy widows. Patricia, Margaret, Nancy, and you thought I'd be next." He stared at me silently. He didn't try to deny it, didn't try to explain or apologize or beg, just stared with those cold blue eyes that I'd once thought were beautiful. "I have one question," I said, and my voice finally cracked. "Was any of it real? Even one moment? The poetry, the sunset walks, the way you held me at night? Was there even 1 second where you actually cared about me? Or was I just a mark from the beginning?" Richard looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled, a small, cold smile that made my blood run to ice. "You were supposed to be easy," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Lonely widow, desperate for companionship, trusting to a fault, just like the others. But you were smarter than you looked, Eleanor. Suspicious, careful. You kept your finances separate, kept that lawyer involved, asked too many questions. I'll give you credit for that." That was my answer. That was all the closure I was going to get. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I did care about you." Just cold calculation and mild annoyance that his con hadn't worked. "Goodbye, Richard," I said, turning toward the door. "Eleanor?" he called out. I paused but didn't turn around. "The mansion really is yours, isn't it? Not the estates. You actually own it. That's why you were so careful about the documents." His voice held a note of genuine curiosity. "We never figured that out until it was too late. That's what killed the plan. We were operating on false information about the ownership structure." I looked back at him over my shoulder. My parents bought that property in 1978 for $200,000. They left it to me in an irrevocable family trust. My name, my maiden name, which I kept legally, is the only name on the deed. David never owned it. You certainly never came close. And you never would have, even if I'd signed every document your family shoved in front of me. His face registered genuine surprise, then something that might have been respect. "Smart? Your late husband's idea?" "My attorney's idea," I said. "He advised me to protect my assets before entering any new relationship. He told me that the world is full of predators who target vulnerable women. I just never thought I'd fall in love with one." I walked out of that room and didn't look back. In the hallway, Detective Blackwood was waiting with Timothy. "Eleanor, we'll need your full formal statement. It'll take several hours. Are you up for that today, or would you prefer to come to the station tomorrow?" "Today," I said immediately. "I want this done. I want to tell you everything while it's fresh, while I'm still angry enough to get through it without falling apart." "Okay, we can use a conference room here at the hospital." Sarah's voice was gentle. "Timothy can be present as your attorney. We'll record everything, and you can take breaks whenever you need them." Over the next 4 hours, I told them everything. Every detail from the moment I met Richard to the moment I walked out of his hospital room. The courtship, the wedding, the red flags I'd noticed, the investigation I'd conducted, the recordings I'd made. I walked them through every conversation, every document, every moment of growing horror as I realized what was happening. Timothy sat beside me the entire time, occasionally interjecting with legal clarifications, making sure I didn't say anything that could be twisted or used against me later. Sarah recorded everything, asked clarifying questions, made detailed notes. When we finally finished, the sun was setting. I'd been at the hospital for 12 hours. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, running on nothing but adrenaline and stubborn determination. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we build the criminal case," Sarah said. "We'll arrest Richard as soon as he's medically cleared, probably tomorrow. We'll interview Janet, who seems willing to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. We'll subpoena all their financial records, phone records, emails. We'll contact Nancy Blackwell and see if she's willing to testify now that there's criminal prosecution. We'll coordinate with Margaret's and Patricia's families about potentially reopening investigations into their deaths. And me? I asked. What do I do? Timothy answered. You go home, you change all your locks, you file restraining orders against all of them, which I've already prepared. You secure all your financial accounts. And you start the process of annulling your marriage to Richard Morrison on the grounds of fraud. Annulment. As if the marriage had never existed. As if I could erase the last 8 months like they were a mistake in an accounting ledger. Maybe I could. I'll take you home, Timothy said gently. My wife is making dinner. You shouldn't be alone tonight. No, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I need to be in my own house. I need to reclaim my space. They've been in my home, touching my things, planning how to steal it all. I need to be there alone and remember that it's mine, that it's always been mine, that they never had any power over me that I didn't give them. Timothy looked worried, but he nodded. Okay, but I'm calling Emily and your son. They need to know what's happened. You need your family right now. My family. My real family. The people who'd loved me for 69 years without asking for anything except my love in return. Okay, I whispered. Call them. As Timothy drove me home in the growing darkness, I looked out at the Pacific Ocean, dark and vast and beautiful. My phone started buzzing, Emily calling, her voice frantic with worry when I answered. I told her everything, heard her shock and rage and fierce protective love. My son called minutes later from Singapore, already looking at flights. And when I walked into my mansion, my home, the one I'd almost lost, I stood in the entryway and felt something shift inside me. I'd spent weeks being afraid, weeks pretending, weeks gathering evidence and building my case. Now the pretending was over. The evidence was delivered. The trap had sprung, and I was still standing. I walked through every room, turning on every light, reclaiming every space. This was my home, my sanctuary, my fortress. And no one, not Richard, not his predatory family, not anyone, would ever take it from me. Tomorrow, I'd start the legal battles. Tomorrow, I'd face restraining order hearings and police interviews and probably media attention. Tomorrow, I'd begin the process of unraveling my marriage and rebuilding my life. But tonight, I stood on my bedroom balcony, looking out at the moonlight on the water, and I made myself a promise. I would never be easy prey again. I would never doubt my instincts. I would never let anyone make me feel weak or confused or incompetent. I was Eleanor Patricia Morrison. I was 69 years old, and I had just won a war. The battle wasn't over yet. But I'd already claimed the victory that mattered most. I'd saved myself. The weeks following the arrests blurred together in a haze of legal proceedings, police interviews, and endless paperwork. I gave my formal deposition 3 separate times. I met with prosecutors who explained the charges in detail: conspiracy to commit elder abuse, fraud, assault, falsification of records. The list went on and on. Richard was arrested the day after his family, charged as the ringleader of the operation. I wasn't there to see it happen, but Detective Blackwood told me he'd walked out of the hospital in handcuffs without saying a word, his face blank as stone. Good. I hoped he felt even a fraction of the violation I'd experienced. Timothy worked tirelessly on the civil side. The annulment was filed within 48 hours, citing fraud as grounds. California law was clear. A marriage obtained through fraudulent pretenses could be voided as if it never existed. Richard contested it, of course, through his attorney, but the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings alone proved he'd married me under false pretenses with criminal intent. I changed every lock in the house. I hired a security company to install a real system: cameras, motion sensors, the works. I went through every room with a fine-tooth comb, looking for anything Richard or his family might have left behind. In the guest room closet, I found a small notebook in Gregory's handwriting, the surveillance log Janet had mentioned. Pages and pages of my daily activities, photographed and documented to build their narrative of incompetence. Subject left house at 9:47 a.m., returned at 11:23 a.m., appeared confused about where she'd parked. I hadn't been confused. I'd parked in a different spot because my usual space was blocked by a delivery truck. But in their hands, every normal action became evidence of decline. I burned that notebook in my fireplace and watched the pages curl and blacken. It felt like exorcism. Emily flew in from Boston 3 days after the arrests. She walked into my house, took one look at my face, and burst into tears. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have been here. I should have noticed something was wrong. I should have—" "You couldn't have known," I said, holding her tight. "I didn't know, and I was living with him. They were professionals, sweetheart. This is what they do." My son called from Singapore every day, apologizing that he couldn't get away from work immediately, but would visit within the month. "Mom, I'll kill him," he kept saying. "I swear to God, I'll kill him." "No, you won't," I said firmly. "You'll let the justice system handle him. I didn't go through all this to watch my son end up in prison for assault." But I loved him for the rage in his voice. I loved them both for their fierce protectiveness, even though it came too late to prevent what had happened. The media found out, of course. Elderly widow Foyle's family con made the local news. Then a crime blogger picked it up. Then it went regional. My lawyer advised me not to speak to reporters, so I didn't. But that didn't stop them from camping outside my gate, trying to get photos, shouting questions. I closed my curtains and waited for them to get bored. They eventually did. 6 weeks after the arrests, I sat in a courthouse conference room for Richard's bail hearing. The prosecution argued he was a flight risk with a pattern of targeting vulnerable women. The defense argued he was a 71-year-old man with no prior convictions and strong ties to the community. The judge set bail at $500,000 with ankle monitoring and a restraining order keeping him 500 yards away from me at all times. He posted bail within hours. I don't know who put up the money. Probably some asset we hadn't discovered yet, some account hidden under another name. The thought of him out there, free to walk around, made my skin crawl. But Detective Blackwood assured me the ankle monitor was sophisticated. "If he comes within 600 feet of your property, we'll know immediately, and he'll go straight back to jail." I installed panic buttons throughout my house anyway, just in case. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 months out. In the meantime, Nancy Blackwell contacted the prosecutors. She'd heard about the case and wanted to testify. She was willing to break her NDA. Her lawyers argued that NDAs don't apply when covering up ongoing criminal activity. I spoke with Nancy on the phone one evening. She was 73, her voice shaky but determined. "I knew something was wrong, but I was too embarrassed to push it," she told me. "I thought people would think I was a foolish old woman who'd been taken in by a con man. I took the settlement because I just wanted it to be over. But Eleanor, you fought back. You were braver than I was. And now I can be brave too." "You were never foolish," I told her. "You were human. You wanted love and companionship. There's nothing foolish about that." She cried. We both did. Margaret Chen's daughter also reached out. Her mother's death had never sat right with the family, but the police had ruled it accidental, and they'd been too grief-stricken to push. Now, with criminal charges pending, they were demanding the case be reopened. "My mother was careful," Margaret's daughter told me, her voice thick with old grief and new rage. "She didn't just fall downstairs. Someone pushed her. I know it, and I'm going to prove it." I hoped she could. I hoped Richard would pay for every single woman he'd destroyed. But even as the legal machinery ground forward, even as I gave statements and reviewed evidence and prepared for trial, I felt something shifting inside me. The fear was fading. The betrayal still hurt. God, it hurt, but it was becoming something else, something harder, something like armor. I started seeing a therapist. Dr. Patricia Rosen specialized in trauma recovery. She was 60, warm but no nonsense, and she didn't let me hide behind my competence and strength. "You can be strong and still be wounded," she told me in our third session. "You can have handled everything perfectly and still need to grieve what you lost." "I didn't lose anything real," I said. "It was all fake." "The love you felt was real," she said gently. "The hope, the joy, the belief in a second chance. Those were real. You lost that. And you're allowed to grieve it." So I did. I let myself cry for the life I'd imagined, for the partnership I'd thought I'd found, for the loneliness that had made me vulnerable in the first place. And slowly, so slowly, I started to heal. 3 months after the arrests, I was having coffee on my terrace when my phone rang. It was Detective Blackwood. "Eleanor, I wanted you to hear this from me first," she said. "Kyle Morrison took a plea deal this morning." My heart jumped. "What kind of deal?" "He's agreed to testify against his father and sister in exchange for reduced charges. He'll plead guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and serve 18 months with 3 years probation. He's also agreed to surrender his law license permanently." 18 months seemed like nothing for what they'd tried to do, but Sarah anticipated my reaction. "I know it doesn't seem like enough, but his testimony will be crucial for convicting Richard and Diane." Kyle documented everything: emails, financial projections, strategy sessions. He kept records like the lawyer he is. With his cooperation, we can prove premeditation and pattern. We can connect this case to Nancy, Margaret, and Patricia. He's giving us everything. "Why?" I asked. "Why would he turn on his own family?" "Self-preservation," Sarah said bluntly. "He's 42 years old. He didn't want to spend the next 20 years in prison, and I think, on some level, he knew how wrong this was. Not enough to stop, but enough to feel guilty about it now that he's caught." Vanessa took a deal too, testifying in exchange for probation and community service, given that she hadn't been involved in the previous cons. She'd only married Kyle 2 years ago and claimed she'd been manipulated into participating. I didn't know if I believed that, but it wasn't my decision to make. Janet was offered full immunity in exchange for her testimony. She'd kept emails, recordings, documents. Everything the prosecution needed to prove the conspiracy went back months before Richard ever met me. That left Richard and Diane facing trial. Their attorneys filed motion after motion, trying to suppress evidence, trying to get charges dismissed. But Timothy and the prosecutors pushed back on everything. "They're desperate," Timothy told me over lunch one afternoon, "and desperate people make mistakes." The trial date was set for 6 months out. I'd have to testify. I'd have to sit in a courtroom and recount every moment of betrayal, every lie, every manipulation. I'd have to face Richard and Diane and speak my truth in front of strangers. The thought terrified me, but I'd do it. I'd do it for Margaret and Patricia and Nancy. I'd do it for every widow who'd ever been targeted by predators. And I'd do it for myself. 4 months after the arrests, I woke up one morning and realized something had changed. The knot of anxiety in my chest had loosened. The hypervigilance that had made me jump at every sound had faded. The nightmares about Richard standing over my bed had stopped. I walked out onto my balcony with my coffee and watched the sun rise over the Pacific. The ocean was calm, golden light spreading across the water like a blessing. And for the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't fear or rage or grief. I felt peace, not complete peace. I still had months of legal battles ahead, not perfect peace. I still woke up some nights feeling the ghost of Richard's arms around me, still felt the sting of betrayal when I least expected it. But peace nonetheless. The peace of knowing I'd survived. The peace of knowing I'd fought back. The peace of standing on my own balcony, in my own home, with my own strength, and knowing that no one had taken any of it from me. I picked up my phone and called Emily. "Hey, sweetheart. I was thinking maybe you and the kids could come visit next month. I want to make paella on the terrace, like your dad and I used to." Her voice was surprised, pleased. Yeah, Mom, we'd love that. When I hung up, I looked out at the ocean again and smiled. Richard Morrison had tried to destroy me. He'd married me with the intention of stealing my home, my savings, my freedom, possibly my life. But he'd failed. Not because I was perfect or fearless or unbreakable. Because I was smart. Because I trusted my instincts. Because I refused to be a victim. And because when it mattered most, I'd saved myself. The legal battle wasn't over. The emotional healing would take time. But the most important victory, the one that actually mattered, I'd already won. I was still standing, still strong, still here. And I was going to be just fine. 6 months after the arrests, I sat in Superior Court of Los Angeles, courtroom 4B, watching Richard Morrison walk in wearing an expensive navy suit and handcuffs. The bailiff guided him to the defense table where his attorney, a slick corporate type named Martin Brenner, was arranging papers with the kind of confidence that comes from charging $800 an hour. Diane sat at the adjacent defense table with her own attorney, a sharp-faced woman who'd already filed 17 motions trying to get evidence suppressed. They'd been granted separate trials, but both were being heard by Judge Andrea Castellanos, a no-nonsense 58-year-old former prosecutor who'd seen every con in the book. This was it, the trial I'd been preparing for, dreading and desperately needing all at once. Emily sat behind me in the gallery, her hand occasionally squeezing my shoulder. Timothy was at the prosecution table with Deputy District Attorney Marcus Williams, a 45-year-old veteran of elder abuse cases who'd told me, "I'm going to make sure they never hurt another widow again." The jury filed in, 12 faces I'd been studying for days during voir dire. 7 women, 5 men, ages ranging from 28 to 71. The older woman in the front row, Mrs. Chen, had lost her own mother to financial exploitation. She'd made it through jury selection because neither side wanted to use a challenge on her, and I'd watched her face during opening statements. She was on my side. I could feel it. Judge Castellanos gavelled the court to order. The people of California versus Richard Morrison and Diane Morrison will begin with the prosecution's case. Mr. Williams? Marcus stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried authority without being loud. Your Honor, the people call Eleanor Patricia Morrison to the stand. My legs felt unsteady as I walked to the witness box. The bailiff held out a Bible. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do, I said. My voice was stronger than I felt. Marcus approached the witness stand with a gentle smile. Mrs. Morrison, can you please state your full name and age for the record? Eleanor Patricia Morrison. I'm 69 years old. And how do you know the defendants? I looked directly at Richard. He held my gaze, his face neutral. Diane was staring at her notepad, her jaw tight. Richard Morrison is my husband, I said. The word tasted bitter. Legally, anyway. I've filed for annulment, but it hasn't been finalized yet. Diane Morrison is his daughter, my stepdaughter. Can you tell the jury how you met Richard Morrison? And so I began. I told them everything. The charity gala, the whirlwind courtship, the wedding at my mansion. I told them about the small red flags I'd noticed and dismissed. Diane's constant property appraisals. Kyle's pressure to consolidate assets. Vanessa's gaslighting about my memory. Marcus walked me through each piece of evidence methodically. The surveillance photos showing I'd been targeted months before Richard coincidentally met me. The recordings of the family planning the fake medical emergency. The toxicology reports showing exactly what substances Vanessa had given Richard. Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to play a recording now. Can you tell the jury what this is? That's a recording I made on my phone when I came home early one evening and overheard Richard and his family in my dining room. The courtroom went silent as the recording played. The jury heard Diane's voice. Mom's smarter than we thought, but she's also emotionally invested. We can use that. Then Kyle. The medical emergency scenario is still our best play. Vanessa. I can get the medication to simulate stroke symptoms. benzodiazepines combined with a muscle relaxant. Once he's in ICU, Eleanor will be vulnerable, scared. That's when you step in with the POA documents. Kyle again. Once we have medical POA, we stage her mental incompetence. I become her conservator. Then we liquidate the assets, move Eleanor to a care facility, and split everything. I watched the jury's faces. Mrs. Chen's mouth was pressed into a thin line. A younger man in the second row looked physically ill. Even the skeptical-looking guy in the back, the one I'd worried might sympathize with the defendants, was shaking his head in disgust. The recording continued with Richard's cold voice. "Just make sure the medication doesn't actually hurt me. Small price for a $5 million payout." When it ended, the silence in the courtroom felt heavy as lead. "Mrs. Morrison," Marcus said quietly, "how did you feel when you heard your husband and his family discussing this plan?" "Objection," Brenner called out. "Relevance. The witness's feelings aren't material to the charges." "I'll allow it," Judge Castellanos said. "The witness may answer." I looked at the jury. I felt like I was going to vomit. These were people I'd welcomed into my home, into my life. I'd loved Richard. I'd trusted him. And they were discussing destroying me like I was a business transaction. They talked about having me institutionalized, about taking everything I'd worked my whole life to build. They called it the disposal phase, like I was garbage to be thrown away once they'd taken what they wanted. My voice cracked on the last words. Emily was crying quietly behind me. I saw Mrs. Chen wipe her eyes. Marcus let that sit for a moment before continuing. "Mrs. Morrison, can you explain why you didn't immediately confront them or call the police?" "Because I knew they'd planned this carefully. I knew if I confronted them without irrefutable evidence, they'd find a way to turn it around on me. They'd already been building a narrative that I was confused, possibly suffering from dementia. If I'd accused them without proof, it would have played right into their hands. So, what did you do instead?" "I gathered evidence. I installed hidden cameras with police approval. I recorded every conversation. I worked with Detective Sarah Blackwood to build a criminal case. And I let them spring their trap, the fake medical emergency, so we could catch them in the act." Marcus walked me through the hospital scene. The forged power of attorney documents Kyle had tried to get me to sign. Vanessa's attempts to isolate me. The moment Detective Blackwood arrived with Timothy and confronted them with everything I'd discovered. We went through it all, piece by piece, for 3 hours. When Marcus finally said, "No further questions, Your Honor," I felt like I'd run a marathon. Then Brenner stood up for cross-examination. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "you've painted quite a dramatic picture. But isn't it true that you never actually signed any documents?" "Because I realized what was happening and refused to sign them. But no crime was actually completed, was it? You weren't defrauded. You didn't lose any money. Your assets were never actually transferred." "Because I stopped them," I said firmly. "The fact that they didn't succeed doesn't mean they didn't try. Attempted fraud is still a crime. You recorded my client and his family without their knowledge. Isn't that illegal in California?" "Not when there's reasonable belief that a felony is being committed. Elder abuse is a felony." He tried a different angle. "Mrs. Morrison, you're a wealthy woman. You own a $4.5 million mansion. Isn't it possible you're simply a paranoid elderly person who misinterpreted innocent family concern?" I looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm 69 years old. I was a senior accountant for 35 years. I managed multi-million-dollar portfolios. I caught financial fraud for a living. I'm not paranoid, Mr. Brenner. I'm experienced, and I know the difference between family concern and a criminal conspiracy." He tried to rattle me for another hour, but I'd prepared for this. Timothy had run me through every possible question, every angle they might use. I stayed calm, stayed factual, stayed strong. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, I was exhausted, but felt a strange sense of completion. I'd told my truth. The jury had heard everything. Now it was up to them. Over the next 2 weeks, the prosecution built an overwhelming case. Detective Blackwood testified about the investigation and the pattern they'd uncovered, connecting Richard to multiple wealthy widows. Dr. Marcus Chen testified about the toxicology findings and how the substances in Richard's system could only have been administered deliberately. Timothy testified about the fraudulent legal documents and how they were designed to trap me. Then came the witnesses that changed everything. Nancy Blackwell took the stand, her hands shaking, but her voice clear. She was 73, elegant in a navy dress, and she told the jury about her own nightmare with Richard Morrison. He courted me for 4 months. We got married. Within 6 months, his family was pressuring me to sign over my Newport Beach property. When I refused, they started telling people I was unstable, that I needed psychiatric help. I found documents showing they'd planned to have me involuntarily committed. I settled with an NDA because I was terrified and alone. But Eleanor fought back. She was braver than I was. Margaret Chen's daughter testified next, her grief still raw 5 years later. My mother was careful. She didn't just fall down those stairs. 2 weeks before she died, she told me Richard's family was pressuring her about her will. She was going to leave him. Then she was dead, and Richard inherited everything despite a prenuptial agreement that should have protected her assets. The police called it an accident, but I never believed it. I still don't. The jury looked at Richard with new eyes. This wasn't a one-time mistake or misunderstanding. This was a pattern. A predator who'd been hunting vulnerable women for years. Kyle testified as part of his plea deal, his voice flat and emotionless as he described the planning, the strategy sessions, the calculated way they'd targeted me. We researched her for 6 months before Dad approached her. We knew she was widowed, lonely, financially comfortable. We thought she'd be easy. We were wrong. "Why did you do it?" Marcus asked him. Kyle was silent for a long moment. "Because it worked before. Because we needed the money. Because we convinced ourselves she wouldn't really be hurt, that she'd be taken care of in a nice facility somewhere. We justified it. But there's no justification for what we planned. It was evil, and I have to live with that." Diane's trial happened simultaneously in the afternoons. Her defense was that she'd been manipulated by her father, that she'd thought they were protecting him from a gold digger. But the evidence destroyed that narrative. Emails showed she'd been the one researching conservatorship laws, scouting care facilities with the cheapest rates, calculating how quickly they could liquidate my assets. The most damning evidence came from her own computer, a spreadsheet labeled Morrison Family Financial Recovery Plan, showing how they'd split the proceeds from selling my mansion and liquidating my accounts. Each family member had a designated percentage. Diane's was 30%, the largest share after Richard's 40%. When both sides rested and closing arguments finished, Judge Castellanos gave the jury their instructions. "You must decide whether the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendants conspired to commit elder abuse, fraud, and assault. You must evaluate the evidence objectively and render a verdict based on facts, not sympathy or bias." The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days of sitting in the courthouse hallway with Emily, drinking terrible coffee, trying not to imagine what would happen if they acquitted. On the 3rd day, we got the call. The jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom. Richard and Diane were brought in, both looking pale and tense. The jury filed in, their faces carefully neutral. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Castellanos asked. The forewoman, Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who'd lost her own mother, stood. "We have, Your Honor. In the case of the People versus Richard Morrison, on the charge of conspiracy to commit elder abuse, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud? Guilty. On the charge of assault with intent to administer a harmful substance? Guilty." I heard Emily gasp behind me. Timothy squeezed my hand. The courtroom erupted in whispers until the judge gavelled for order. They went through all 17 charges, guilty on every single one. Then Diane's verdict, guilty, guilty, guilty. I watched Richard's face as the verdicts were read. He showed nothing, no emotion, no reaction. Just stared straight ahead like he was somewhere else entirely. But Diane crumbled. She put her face in her hands and sobbed, her shoulders shaking. Judge Castellanos set sentencing for 3 weeks out and remanded both defendants without bail. Based on the severity of the crimes and the defendants' demonstrated pattern of targeting vulnerable victims, I find them to be a danger to the community. As the bailiffs led them away in handcuffs, Richard finally looked at me. Just for a second, our eyes met across the courtroom. I couldn't read his expression. Regret? Anger? Nothing? I didn't care anymore. I'd spent enough time trying to understand him, trying to find humanity in someone who'd seen me as nothing but prey. I looked away first, not because I was afraid or ashamed, but because he simply didn't matter to me anymore. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward my face. Marcus made a brief statement about justice being served and hoping this verdict would encourage other victims to come forward. Timothy shielded me from the worst of it, guiding me to his car. But before I got in, I turned to face the cameras. "I want to say something," I said. The reporters quieted, focused on me. "I'm 69 years old. For 8 months, I was married to a man who planned to destroy me. But I'm still here. I'm still strong. And I want every widow, every elderly person, every vulnerable person watching this to know. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't be afraid to investigate, to ask questions, to protect yourself. And don't ever let anyone make you feel weak or incompetent just because of your age. We're not easy targets. We're survivors." Emily was crying again, but she was smiling too. "Mom, I'm so proud of you." As Timothy drove me home through Los Angeles traffic, I looked out at the city I'd lived in my whole life and felt something shift inside me one final time. The trial was over. Justice had been served. The legal battle I'd been fighting for 6 months had finally ended in victory. But the real victory, the one that actually mattered, I'd won the day I decided to fight back instead of becoming a victim. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Richard received 15 years in state prison. Diane received 12 years. Vanessa, who'd taken a plea deal, got 3 years probation and 1,000 hours of community service. Kyle served his 18 months and would spend the rest of his life without a law license. Janet, who'd cooperated fully, received immunity, but would live with the knowledge of what her family had done. She sent me a letter afterward. I never opened it. I didn't need her apology or explanation. The mansion was officially, legally, permanently mine. The annulment was granted. Eleanor Patricia Morrison was my name again, with no trace of Richard Morrison remaining except in court documents and my memories. And I was free. 1 year after the trial, I'm standing on my bedroom balcony watching the sunrise over the Pacific Ocean, and I realize something profound. I'm happy. Not the fragile, desperate happiness I felt when I first met Richard, that grasping need for someone to fill the loneliness. This is something deeper, stronger. It's the happiness of a woman who knows exactly who she is and what she's worth. The mansion is still mine, more secure than ever. I've updated the trust documents with Timothy's help, created ironclad protections that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to ever challenge my ownership. The security system is state-of-the-art. But more importantly, I don't live in fear anymore. I live in peace. Emily visits every few months now, bringing my grandchildren. Last month we made paella on the terrace just like I'd promised, the recipe David and I used to make together. My grandson, who's 8, asked why I lived in such a big house all alone. "Because it's mine," I told him simply. And sometimes having your own space is the greatest gift you can give yourself. My son flew in from Singapore for Christmas. He still feels guilty that he wasn't here when everything happened, but I've told him 100 times. He couldn't have known. None of us could have known. Predators like Richard Morrison are professionals at deception. The legal aftermath took months to fully resolve. Richard's assets were seized to pay restitution to Nancy Blackwell, whose settlement agreement was voided once criminal activity was proven. Margaret Chen's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Richard's estate. It's still pending, but their attorney is confident. Patricia Morrison's family is pursuing similar action. I testified at a hearing to help strip Kyle of his law license permanently. I gave a victim impact statement that detailed every moment of betrayal, every manipulation, every lie. The board didn't even deliberate. They voted unanimously to disbar him. Vanessa lost her nursing license. She'll never work in healthcare again. I felt a grim satisfaction at that. She'd used her medical knowledge to hurt people, to enable a conspiracy that could have destroyed me. She deserved every consequence she faced. Gregory, Richard's nephew, who'd followed me and documented false evidence of my confusion, was charged separately with stalking and conspiracy. He took a plea deal, 2 years probation and mandatory psychological counseling. I don't know where he is now, and I don't care. Janet sent 3 more letters after that first one I never opened. Finally, I read one. It was filled with apologies, explanations about how she'd been manipulated by her brother, how she genuinely believed they were protecting Richard from a gold digger. She asked for forgiveness, said she was seeing a therapist, said she understood if I could never forgive her. I wrote back once. A short note. I don't forgive you, Janet, but I don't hate you either. What I feel is nothing. You're simply not part of my life anymore. I hope you find peace with what you've done. I never heard from her again. Detective Sarah Blackwood still calls occasionally to update me on related cases. Apparently, my trial opened floodgates. 3 other women came forward with stories about Richard Morrison, or men using similar tactics. Sarah's building a task force focused on financial crimes against the elderly. You started something important, she told me last month. You gave other victims the courage to speak up. That meant more to me than any guilty verdict. The idea that my fight might protect someone else, might prevent another widow from going through what I did, that makes every terrifying moment worth it. I started volunteering at a senior center in Santa Monica, teaching financial literacy classes for widows and widowers. I show them how to protect their assets, how to recognize red flags in new relationships, how to trust their instincts. The classes are always full. Apparently, there are a lot of us out there, lonely, hopeful, vulnerable to people who see our loneliness as opportunity. Last week, a 72-year-old woman named Grace stayed after class. My boyfriend's been asking about my house, she said quietly, wanting to know if it's in my name or a trust, if I have a will, who inherits. We've only been dating 3 months. Is that weird? Yes, I told her firmly. That's weird, and it's a red flag. Have you run a background check on him? She looked embarrassed. Isn't that paranoid? Paranoid is what people call you when you're smart enough to protect yourself, I said. Do the background check, Grace. You deserve to know who you're spending time with. She did. Turns out her boyfriend had 2 previous marriages to wealthy women, both of whom died under suspicious circumstances. Grace filed a police report. The investigation is ongoing. She sent me flowers last week with a note. You saved my life. Maybe I did. Or maybe I just helped her save herself, which is even better. Dr. Patricia Rosen, my therapist, says I've made remarkable progress in processing the trauma. We still meet monthly, but the sessions are different now. Less about the betrayal, more about building the future I want. Do you think you'll ever date again? She asked me in our last session. I thought about it, really thought about it. Maybe someday. But I'm not lonely anymore. I have friends, family, purpose, passions. I don't need a partner to complete me. If someone comes along who adds to my life without asking me to diminish myself, maybe. But I'm not looking, and I'm certainly not settling. She smiled. That's the healthiest thing I've heard you say in a year. The media attention finally died down about 6 months ago. For a while I was that widow who caught the con artist. There were articles, a segment on a crime documentary show, even a producer who wanted to make a movie about my story. I declined. This is my life, not entertainment. But I did do one interview with a journalist from a senior advocacy magazine. I wanted to get the message out to people who needed to hear it. The article was titled, "At 69, She Refused to Be a Victim." It ran with a photo of me on my terrace, looking out at the ocean. I looked strong in that picture, confident, alive. That's exactly how I feel. Richard is in Corcoran State Prison serving his 15-year sentence. He'll be 86 when he's released, if he lives that long. I don't think about him often anymore. When I do, it's not with the sharp pain of betrayal. It's with something closer to pity. He spent his whole life taking from people, destroying trust, exploiting vulnerability. And what does he have to show for it? A prison cell and a legacy of harm. I have a mansion overlooking the Pacific, grandchildren who adore me, friends who respect me, and the knowledge that I fought back and won. I know which life I'd choose. Diane is in the California Institution for Women. She'll be 57 when she's released. I heard through Timothy that she's been denied parole twice. Each time, I submitted a victim impact statement opposing her release. I'll continue doing that every time she's eligible. Not out of revenge, but out of protection for whoever she might target next. Sometimes people ask me if I regret marrying Richard. It's a complicated question. I regret the pain, the betrayal, the violation of trust. But I don't regret what I learned about myself. That I'm stronger than I knew, smarter than I gave myself credit for, braver than I believed possible. I'm 70 now. My hair is more silver than brown, and I have wrinkles that weren't there 2 years ago. But when I look in the mirror, I like what I see. I see a survivor, a fighter, a woman who refused to let predators define her final chapter. Last month, I hosted a dinner party on my terrace, the first real entertaining I'd done since before Richard. 15 friends, mostly women from my financial literacy class and book club. We ate fresh seafood, drank wine, watched the sunset, paint the ocean gold and pink. And I told them my story, not the sanitized version, but the real one. The fear, the investigation, the trial, all of it. When I finished, we sat in silence for a moment. Then one of the women, a 68-year-old retired teacher named Miriam, raised her glass. "To Eleanor," she said, "who taught us that being careful isn't being paranoid, that protecting ourselves isn't being cold, that surviving isn't enough, we deserve to thrive." We all drank to that, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not just happiness, but joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening. I know it wasn't always easy to hear. Betrayal, especially by people we love, cuts deeper than any stranger's cruelty. But I need you to know something, especially if you're watching this as a widow or widower, as someone who's lonely or vulnerable or scared. You are stronger than you think. Your instincts are valid. Your suspicions deserve investigation, not dismissal. And protecting yourself isn't selfish or paranoid. It's wisdom. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If someone is pressuring you to sign documents, to change your will, to hand over control of your finances, stop, get a lawyer, get a second opinion, trust yourself. And if you've been betrayed like I was, know this, it wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong by wanting love, companionship, partnership. The only people who did wrong were the ones who exploited those beautiful human desires. You can survive this. You can come out stronger. I did, and I'm just an ordinary 70-year-old woman who refused to be a victim. I'm standing on my balcony as I finish recording this, watching the ocean that's witnessed every moment of my journey. The water is endless, powerful, and completely indifferent to human drama. It was here before Richard Morrison tried to destroy me, and it'll be here long after I'm gone. But right now, in this moment, it's mine to enjoy. This view, this house, this life, all mine, built by my family, protected by my vigilance, reclaimed by my courage. And that's worth more than any romance, any companionship, any promise of love that comes with strings attached. I'm Eleanor Patricia Morrison. I'm 70 years old. I own a beachfront mansion in Malibu. I have children who love me, grandchildren who adore me, and a life I've fought hard to protect. And I've never been happier. If my story helped you, please share it. Please talk about it. Please help spread the message that we're not easy targets. We're survivors, and we're watching out for each other. Where are you watching from today? Have you experienced something similar? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear that they're not alone. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, send them this video. It might just save their life the way standing up for myself saved mine. Thank you for listening to my story. Take care of yourselves, trust yourselves, protect yourselves. You're worth it.